Hello, today we'll be talking about the nervous system. The nervous system is the major controlling, regulatory, and communicating system in the body. It is a complex collection of nerves and neurons that transmit signals. It is the center of all mental activity, including thought, learning, and memory. Without it, there is no you. There are three principal functions: sensory input, integration, and motor output. The sensory input has receptors on your skin that detect changes in the environment. The integration process that input and decides on what should be done. The motor output is the response that occurs when the nervous system activates certain parts. The nervous system consists of two main parts: the central and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is the nerves that carry sensory messages to the CNS and motor commands from CNS to the muscle glands. The nervous system is made of nerve tissues that are densely packed with cells. A type of cell in the nervous tissue is the neurons that respond to stimuli and transmission signals. The neurons are protected by gaggles and nerviglia. The nerviglia provide support, nourishment, and insulation, and helps with the signal transmission. There are three types of neurons: sensory, motor, and interneurons. Sensory neurons are responsible for converting external stimuli from the environment into corresponding internal stimuli. Motor neurons are located in the central nervous system. They project their axons outside of the CNS to directly or indirectly control muscles. And then interneurons act as middlemen between sensory and motor neurons, which convert external stimuli to internal stimuli and control muscle movement respectively. So the cell body is the neuron's life support. It contains the nucleus, DNA, and other organelles. The dendrites are the branch-like structures extending away from the cell body, and their job is to receive signals from other neurons and send them to the cell body. They're considered the listeners. So the neuron's axon is like the talker because it conducts nerve impulses away from the cell body towards the other neurons and effectors. The neurons can only send one signal and it transmits in one uniform strength and speed at different frequencies.
When a neuron is stimulated, it sends a signal down the axon to the next neuron that has action potential. The signal only moves through the axon at one certain speed and strength. The only thing that can change is the frequency. Our bodies are electrically neutral, with some places more positively or negatively charged than others. Since we all know the opposite charges attract, we have to keep a barrier, or in our bodies, a membrane between the two, until we actually need to use them. Basically, we need to separate them to build the potential that will be used to us at a later time. A resting neuron is a neuron waiting to be activated. It is more negative on the inside than the outside, due to the extra space around it, and the difference between the two is labeled as resting membrane potential. The charge comes from outside the cell being a bunch of positive sodium ions floating around, and on the inside is a bunch of positive potassium ions mixed with big negatively charged proteins. Since there is an extra amount of positive sodium ions on the outside of the cell, the inside with the negative proteins are considered negatively charged. And when a neuron has a negative membrane charge, it is considered to be polarized. But those ions weren't just put there for no reason, no. It was all planned by the sodium-potassium pump. For every 2 potassium ions coming in, 3 sodium ions are pumped out, thus creating a different concentration of sodium and potassium, but also a difference of charges. But the pump is not the only way to pass through the membrane. The membrane also has ion channels to allow specific ions through. These are voltage-gated channels which open and close due to membrane potential, and also ligand-gated channels that only open when a neurotransmitter attaches to it. If only a few of the ion channels open and only a little bit of sodium goes in the cell, then it causes only a small change in membrane potential. For bigger signals all the way through the neuron, you need a bigger charge. And the only way to do that is through action potential. And the best way to do this is by depolarizing the neuron. Once a stimulus is stimulated, the channels open and let sodium in to make it more positive. The full action potential will not come into action until it passes the threshold of negative 55 millivolts. It is an all or none phenomenon, and if the stimulus is too weak and does not pass -55 millivolts, then it just returns to its resting neuron state. But once it does reach the threshold, the voltage-gated channels open, letting sodium come in and increasing the charge to a positive 40 millivolts. The neuron is now becoming depolarized from its original state, and once it reaches its final depolarized state, potassium-gated channels open, letting potassium out and making the neuron repolarized. It then keeps letting potassium out until it goes too far, until it becomes hyperpolarized, dropping the charge to around -75 millivolts, below the threshold, until everything closes and returns to its resting state. While the axon is going through all of this, it cannot receive signals from any other stimulus. This is called the refractory period, and it helps keep signals from going both ways at once. The synapse is a meeting point between two neurons, which is right here. When action potential goes through the axon, the message ends up at the synapse. Then the synapse makes the signal into different signals and transports it to other neurons. The cell sending the signal is called the presynaptic neuron, which sends the signal to the synaptic terminal, or axon terminal, which is over here as well, where it is filled with synaptic vesicles, all holding a bunch of neurotransmitters, and the receiving cell is the postsynaptic neuron, and receives the neurotransmitters at the receptor region, which is about this way, usually on the dendrites. The synapse and the receptor region never ever touch, and the region between them is called the synaptic cleft, which is this gap right in the middle. When the action potential reaches the synapse, calcium-gated channels open and release calcium into the synaptic vesicles, making the vesicles combine with the membrane and discharging the messengers. These neurotransmitters diffuse across the gap, binding with the receptors of the receptor region on the postsynaptic neuron. Depending on which neurotransmitter binds with what receptor, the neuron might become excited or inhibited. Excited neurotransmitters depolarize, making the chances of action potential in this postsynaptic neuron much higher. On the other hand, it can also become inhibitory, making the neuron hyperpolarize and making it much harder to reach action potential. The chances of the postsynaptic neuron reaching action potential relies on the sum of all the excitations and inhibitions of the neuron.